Oryx, the Taken King, born Arish, and formerly known as Oryx, meaning the long thought, was the sovereign of the Osmium throne, the god king of the Hive, and the master of the Taken. Reborn in the darkness itself through a wicked pact with the worm gods, Oryx is the founder of the Hive race, alongside his sisters and fellow deities, Savathûn the Witch Queen, and Xivu Arath, the god of war. Of all the Hive gods, he alone held the power to bend other races to his will through the power to take. Oryx is also the father of the dreaded Crota, a deadly Hive prince who slew thousands of guardians through the great disaster, Nokris, his estranged firstborn and herald of the worm god Zal, as well as 2 death singers and inventors of the Oversoul, twins Iranuk and Irhalak. Enraged at the death of Crota, Oryx traveled to the Sol system aboard his Dreadnaught, seeking revenge, but was defeated by the Guardian and escaped to his throne world. His second match with the Guardians resulted in his permanent death, and ended the threat he posed to the Sol system, leaving behind a vacancy on his Osmium throne that would remain empty for many years to come. Oryx traces his origins to a gas giant named Fundament, where the Proto-Hive eked out a harsh existence on floating continents, comprised of the shards of their shattered homeworld. Oryx was born as Arish, a Proto-Hive female, and one of 3 surviving daughters of the Osmium King, ruler of the continent called the Osmium Court. Arish's sisters were Xivu and Sathona, who together made up the final brood stirred by the Osmium King. When the Osmium King was 10 years old, a lifetime to a Proto-Hive, he succumbed to senility madness, fearing an event called the Synergy, wherein Fundament's 52 moons would align and create a massive tidal wave that would destroy all of Fundament's civilizations. Teox, a sterile mother who had served as a teacher to the king's daughters, feared the royal heirs were too weak to succeed the king and invited a rival kingdom, the Helium Drinkers of the Helium Court, to invade the Osmium Court as their regent. But the Helium Drinkers invaded and slew the Osmium King. But Arish and her sisters, 2 years old at the time, escaped on a ship and vowed to return one day for their revenge. After a year of traveling the sea, the sisters salvaged an ancient high-tech ship they called the Needle from the Shadowy Maelstrom. Xivu wanted to sell it at the Kaharan Atoll, a gathering place of Fundament's many species, in order to raise enough money to hire a mercenary army, but Arish wanted to take command of the ship. Sathona sided with Arish, goaded on by a worm that their father had kept. The worm had washed up on the Osmium Court's shores and was seemingly dead, but Sathona could hear it speak. The sisters spent the next 2 years reactivating the ship, until Arish decided to use it to fulfill its intended purpose. She wanted to dive into Fundament's core in the hopes of learning a secret that would prevent the Synergy. As they descended, the sisters encountered a vast creature called the Leviathan, a disciple of the Traveler. The Leviathan warned the sisters against proceeding any further, telling them that they faced a choice between the sky and the deep, the light and the darkness, the way of life and the way of death. The sisters rejected the Leviathan, unable to accept that allowing their people to suffer was a better way, and instead decided to follow the worm Sathona had saved, which urged them to continue diving. Deep within the Fundament Ocean, the sisters encountered the worm gods, who drew their power from the darkness itself. Yul, Ir, Zul, and Akka, the virtuous worms. The worm gods claimed that they had lived and grown in Fundament's depths for millions of years, trapped by the Leviathan and the Traveler. They had called many species to Fundament, hoping one would be tenacious enough to find them. They offered Xivu, Sathona, and Arish immortality if they would allow themselves to be hosts for the worm's larvae, with the caveat that if the sisters ceased to obey their natures, Xivu's desire to test her strength, Sathona's cunning, Arish's inquisitiveness, their worms would consume them. Furthermore, the stronger the sisters became, the greater their worms' appetites would be. The sisters accepted the pact. Xivu took the Night Morph and became Xivu Arath, the god of war. Sathona took the Mother Morph and became Savathûn, the Witch Queen, and Arish took the King Morph, transforming into a male and becoming Oryx, the king of the Hive. Over the following years, the siblings returned to their people and spread the worms among them, creating the first hive and enabling them to first liberate the Osmium Court, then drive Teox and the other fearful species of Fundament to Kaharan Atoll, and finally to build spaceships and break free of Fundament entirely. as Oryx and his sisters forced an ultimatum on the remaining proto-hive to accept the worms or perish. Oryx turned his attention to Fundament's moons, the Ammonites, who had allied with the Traveler and gave asylum to Teox. Initially, he was willing to negotiate with the Ammonites, but his sister Savathûn, under pressure from the worms, killed Oryx as punishment. Rather than dying, Oryx's soul instead passed to the Ascendant Realm, or the Throne World, where his soul resided until he returned to the mortal realm. Rebuked, Oryx purged what sympathy and goodwill he had left. Becoming a merciless tyrant, he and his sisters warred with and killed one another on a regular basis after the defeat of the Ammonites, as part of their worship of the sword logic, in their attempt to become the sharpest blades in the universe, heading to their Ascendant Realms when defeated. Their war of revenge against Teox had transformed into a campaign of genocide, when they slew the Ammonites and other interstellar civilizations to feed their worms. The Lords of the Hive also established their Ascendant Realms, with Oryx naming his the High War. During the war with the Akume, Oryx came to realize that the worms had deceived him and his sisters. Their worms' appetites were growing past their ability to feed with death. Meeting with his sisters in the Ascendant Realm, surrounded by their servants, some of which despised them for showing weakness, they despaired over their dilemma. When his sisters offered their power to help Oryx find a way to save them, Oryx killed them, then used that power to confront his patron god Akka. He killed Akka so that he may steal its ability to call upon the deep, and created the Tablets of Ruin, which gave him the power to take. His transformation complete, Oryx was now Oryx, the Taken King. During the subsequent war with the Akume, Oryx revived Xivu Arath in an act of war, and revived Savathûn in an act of cunning. He then decreed the Tith system. Each hive would kill their enemies, take some to feed their worm, and tith the rest to their superior. Thralls would tith to acolytes, acolytes would tith to knights or wizards, the knights and wizards would tith to the Ascendant Hive. Those who commanded legions of warriors and earned the right to enter the Hive God's Ascendant Realms. All of this violence would eventually reach Oryx, Savathûn, and Xivu Arath, allowing their worms to feed on violence while continuing to invoke their inner natures. After destroying the Tashabethi, Oryx used his Tablets of Ruin to commune directly with the voice in the darkness itself. It explained to Oryx that the sword logic was not death for the sake of death, but to aid in the creation of a final shape, which was its ultimate endgame to bring order to an anarchic universe. However, while he spoke to the witness, Savathûn and Xivu Arath conspired to maroon him in its realm, cut off his flow of tribute, and steal his tablets. Wandering within the deep and fearing that he was becoming a nihilist, Oryx eventually decided to sire his own spawn. After fighting his way back into real space and defeating his sisters, the results of this were Crota and the Death Singer twins Iranuk and Ir-Halak. Unknown to most, Oryx had another son named Nokris, but unlike Crota, he was physically weak in comparison, while Nokris honed his mind, learned powerful magic, and hoarded knowledge. Oryx disfavored him incredibly. Ultimately, Nokris sought to prove himself by speaking to the worm gods the same way Oryx himself did. While most of the worm gods rejected Nokris, the disfavored son managed to forge a pact with the Zal. Nokris traded his heart for some of Zal's power and the secrets of necromancy. Oryx soon learned about his son's activities and was utterly furious. Nokris's actions were sacrilege, as necromancy was a heretical violation of the sword logic. For his crimes, the king of the Hive exiled him and removed all references of his disowned son from the world's grave, the books of sorrow, and most of his own memories. Only a statue remained as the only reference to his forgotten son. One day, the Death Singers were refining their death songs and came up with the idea of the Oversoul. Intrigued, Oryx commanded Crota to watch his sisters, so that he might learn something. However, while Oryx was off studying the deep, Crota was deceived by Savathûn into using his cleaver to cut a portal in the High War, allowing the Vex to enter. For 100 years, the children of Oryx waged war with the Vex, who quickly deduced the sword logic and worship of the deep as key to attaining power in the High War. However, while the Hive were able to overpower the Vex, they were unable to push them out, as they lost too much of their power when entering the Vex conflicts. The situation became so severe that the worm era itself demanded that Oryx return and end the war. Quickly returning to the High War, Oryx used his powers to take the Vex and clear his throne world. Angered at his son's imperfection, Oryx threw Crota into the Vex Gate network, decreeing that come home victorious or die forgotten. At first, Crota resented his father for his seeming abandonment, but after time came to understand his father and built temples to Oryx and the Deep, eventually becoming a vital link in Oryx's Tith of Death and achieving godhood himself. However, Oryx recognized that the threat of the Vex invading his throne world could not happen again, so I moved to the High War into the mighty Dreadnaught, scrimshawed from the remains of Akka. During the Hive's campaign against the Harmony and the Vex, Kira Blade Transform presented Oryx with a simulation of his former self, Arish. Oryx looked upon the simulation with amusement, while Arish looked upon Oryx in horror, demanding to know what he had done to her sisters and her people. In the end, Oryx took Kira and presented the Vex and its simulation to Savathûn. When she asked him what proof they had that they were doing was right, Oryx simply replied that the Hive's existence was proof enough in their own convictions to live eternal by the sword logic. Following the war with the Harmony, Savathûn decided that her fleets would enter the black hole that the Harmony lived around, claiming they would become stronger for it, while Xivu Arath took her fleets away from Oryx's as she felt he constrained her too much. The exact nature of Oryx was once unknown to the Guardians, but the name Oryx appeared often enough in Hive rituals that it could not be ignored. Shrines dedicated to Oryx used by the Hive to communicate with Oryx across the universe were known to exist throughout the Sol system. Osiris studied the Hive extensively and foretold that the spawn of Crota would one day pave the way for Oryx's coming by snuffing out the worlds of light. Members of the Blood of Oryx, Hive sect, are thought to be a direct servant to Oryx himself, though it is speculated that he is the master of all other Hive sects as well. After learning of the death of his son, Crota, Oryx personally traveled to the Sol system aboard his Dreadnaught, accompanied by a Hive fleet and his taken army. While staging his fleet in the rings of Saturn, Oryx and his fleet were attacked by the forces of the Reefborn Awoken, led by Queen Mara Sov and Prince Uldren Sov. An intense battle ensued, as both forces seemed to be equally matched. Queen Mara and her Techions then summoned the Harbingers, weapons of mysterious power that plowed through Oryx's fleet, but was unable to damage the Dreadnaught. Oryx activated his Oversoul in return, and unleashed a massive wave of energy that not only destroyed the Awoken fleet, but also his own, and created a massive hole within Saturn's rings. Now with his forces stalled above Saturn, Oryx was forced to stand down his invasion of the inner system, and therefore unleashed his Taken to regain his lost advantage. At some point after the Battle of Saturn, Oryx's essence took the remaining Techions from the battle, and managed to seep into the Dreaming City that they inadvertently opened for him, causing a Taken corruption that warped the Awoken city in between their reality and their Ascendant plane. There it reached Riven, last of the known wish-granting Amakara that Mara Sov had hid away. Oryx offered to take Riven away. Riven, eager to try bargaining with the king, told Oryx to take whatever he wished, as long as he wished. Oryx's forces first attacked Cabal bases on Phobos and Mars. Cabal detachments were devastated within hours, with the Sand Eaters suffering a catastrophic 58% casualties, while the Blind Legion and the Dust Giants lost 35 and 39% of their numbers respectively. The Vanguard discovered Oryx's presence after sending a Guardian to Phobos to investigate a Cabal distress signal, by which time Taken covens began appearing on multiple worlds, ushering in the Taken War. Oryx was nearly beaten when the Guardian breached his sanctum and attacked him, but this was only a temporary setback. Using his Taken powers, he warped himself into the Ascendant plane. Meanwhile, his Taken, led by his Echoes, continued to harass the system. Once the Blights had been removed, the Guardians turned their attention on Oryx and his Hive and Taken champions. By overthrowing the court of Oryx and killing his minions, they were able to invade deeper into the Dreadnaught. After killing his closest allies, like the War Priest and Golgoroth, including his own daughters, Oryx returns to fight the Guardians once more, this time having transformed himself into his true Ascendant form, a gigantic monster with the power to crush the Guardians with his fists. Here he attempted to pull the Guardians into the darkness and take them, but they were able to use Oryx's own captured light against him. By slaying the Light Eater ogres, and then detonating the light they left behind, the blight in Oryx's chest erupted in a violent burst that brought about the king's permanent death. Through his lifeless, calcified body was left adrift in orbit around Saturn. Oryx's ravenous heart, however, remained. Eris Morn used the heart to construct a weapon, the Torch of Malice. Ironically, in accordance to the Book of Sorrow, Oryx had intended this, as it would have been his final means of maintaining his ascendant immortality through the continued use of the ravenous heart to feed, as well as mantling the one who vanquished him as his successor to the Osmium throne. He only succeeded in one of his goals, however. The one who defeated him, the Guardian, would not take Oryx's throne, and therefore defied the logic Oryx spent millennia perfecting. Known as the first navigator in life, Oryx's defeat would leave the Hive and the Taken leaderless within the Sol system, but unfortunately they were still enough of a threat that the Guardians continued to fight them. The Taken in particular languished without the Master's power, and continued to decay unless someone took Oryx's place. Two individuals in particular would attempt to assume Oryx's throne, Alak-Hul the Darkblade and Malok the Pride of Oryx. However, both were quickly killed by the same Guardians who defeated Oryx, before either could take up the mantle of the Taken King. A third individual, Norusk, the servant of Oryx, attempted to flee the prison of elders, but was slain by a fire team before he could assume the throne. Even by the time of the Red War, the Taken continued to haunt the system, primarily on Earth and Io, and it appears that Oryx's sister, Savathûn, has not only taken command of Hive broods on Titan, but is also attempting to seize control of the Taken. At the end of the Red War and the reawakening of the Traveler in the frozen ice caps on Mars, the worm god Xol awakened to destroy the war-mind core of Rasputin. Leading Xol's army was Oryx's loss and Ison's son, Nokris. However, like Crota and Oryx, Nokris would fail against the Guardians, and Xol followed shortly after. However, it turned out both Xol and Nokris would find a way to cheat death, the former by transforming into the Whisper of the Worm, using the anthem Anthemane, in a similar vein to Oryx, and the latter thanks to Xol's power and his own knowledge of necromancy. At a later date during the chaos that engulfed the reef, Savathûn gained a new and powerful ally in the Amakara Oryx had taken during the beginning of the Taken War, Riven. It is implied that his defeat was due in some way to his previous bargain with Riven. Nonetheless, without a master, Riven was aimless until the Witch Queen encouraged the wish-making creature to serve her, allowing her to be closer to gaining full control over the Taken. Though Riven would ultimately fall to the same warrior of light that defeated Oryx, her physical death would allow the Dreaming City to be taken. Meanwhile, Oryx's youngest sister, Xivu Arath, the Hive god of war, has also begun a campaign of the Hive and Taken to raid the Dreaming City of its secrets. This is likely the result of possible collusion between the two Hive god sisters against the Guardians that vanquished their brother. Oryx's name and form would continue to haunt the Guardians who defeated him. A rogue Lightbearer in particular, the Drifter, found him as the scariest Hive he could think of, and used his form to create a primeval Taken in the Tier 3 of his Reckoning game. This Taken Guardian's face would be known as the likeness of Oryx, which is a shadowy projection of Oryx, the Taken King. Much later on, the daughters of Crota, Oryx's granddaughters led by Hashladun, would seek to use the energies of the Lunar Pyramid to regain the Hive's advantage against the Guardians and avenge their fallen lineage. Taking command of the Hidden Swarm, constructing the massive red fortress of the Scarlet Keep, and utilizing forbidden Hive magic, the daughters of Crota managed to control the nightmares and protect themselves against the Pyramid's energy. Further, Hashladun and her sisters conceived a plot to recreate the fallen Oryx, a necessary violation of the sword logic since the Taken King was never succeeded by his conquerors. However, Hashladun would be destroyed by the Guardians that fell her father and grandfather before her plot could reach fruition. The Witch Queen, the Hive Ghost Finch, led the Guardian to a temple Savathûn had built in the throne world and dedicated to her brother. And guarded by Oryx's foster son, Alak-Hul, now resurrected in the light as the Lightblade, it houses an enormous statue of Oryx defeating Akka. More importantly to the mission, though, it also turned out to be the resting spot of one of the Tablets of Ruin. As the Guardian made their investigation into how the Witch Queen and her Lucent brood managed to claim the light, the tablet they acquired from the temple showed them her plan to steal the Traveler was more, so they learned that Oryx's sister had refused to take her brother's place as Master of the Taken, and on going back to the decision they had made millennia ago. In contrast, Xivu Arath remained steadfast on the path Oryx and their family once walked together on, remaining furious at his death, but more so on the fact the Guardians did not take his place, calling it blasphemy. The Hive god of war would eventually consult with her fallen brother during her time in continuing the goal of reaching the final shape, regaling her exploits in conquering to battle, and her fury in Savathûn's conversion to the light. In the end, Xivu Arath vowed to honor Oryx as the navigator that he was by ensuring the final shape happens. When Titan returned to the solar system after being absorbed by the Witness's powers, Oryx's body was found on the seabed, after stopping an attempt by the Lucent Brood to revive the taken king. A team of the Hidden descended into the abyss to recover body samples for analysis. Following this were found concentrations of taken energy in the cellular structure, and a darkness still active, but without direction and willpower, still capable of inducing hallucinations to those that came near it. This allowed the body to absorb knowledge and memories, but not to react. Furthermore, the biological mass of the corpse demonstrated a slow but active mitosis, which led the body to grow and change even without a mind. Despite the Hidden's advice to dispose of the body, Ikora decided to extract the corpse and hide it in a secure vanguard site, as she did with Savathûn. So, Crota, son of Oryx, also known as the God Knight, or the Light Destroyer, and the Eater of Hope, was an ancient and powerful Hive prince, who wielded the Sword of Crota and killed countless guardians during the city's ill-fated campaign to reclaim the moon. Crota is the main antagonist in the Dark Below, in which the Hive seek to awaken him to lead their armies against humanity. After Oryx fought his way out of the deep, after being trapped within by his sisters Savathûn and Xivu Arath, he decided that he needed children to carry on his lineage, and ensure his flow of tribute was always greater than that of his siblings. Crota was then born, and his father explained to him why he had created him and granted him a sword and a name, stating those would be the only things that he gave his son, and that Crota would have to earn his place upon his father's court, the High War. The newborn Crota continued to listen as his father explained the trap of the traveler, and giving species hope that there was a path in the universe that did not involve conflict, and then gave Crota the name the Eater of Hope, in anticipation of the lives and dreams he would snuff out. Crota was then taken to be introduced to the rest of his family. Crota was soon joined by two sisters, Ir-Halak and Iranak, and a brother, Nokris. However, Nokris was excommunicated and stricken from the Hive's histories for his heretical necromantic practices. Crota himself was made heir to his father in the Osmium throne. Crota also had 4 sworn princes, Bannock, Dakur, Garok, and Marok, forged for him a great sword with which to ravage worlds and drain the light from his foes. At some point, the young Crota would petition his father to forge him from the flesh of the worms a tablet of ruin to bear in battle, and Tithed as tribute to him. Instead, Oryx coldly rebuked his son by setting the newly created tablet with Golgoroth, and explained only tithings of violence from him and his temples were demanded of him. One day, Crota was approached by Oryx in order to watch his sisters as they experimented with the creation of an Oversoul, a paracausal thanatosphere meant to hide their deaths and become harder to kill in the hope that he would learn cunning. However, as Oryx departed to observe the destruction of an alien fortress whirled by the Black Fleet, Crota conspired to learn his sister's secrets of the Oversoul, with which he shared his father's war priest. His aunt Savathûn would influence the arrogant young prince to experiment himself with opening a wound into an open space. The space Crota's sword cut into would open a rift into the Vex network, prompting the Vex to invade Oryx's throne world en masse, much to Savathûn's trickery. Crota engaged the Vex in battle, as they struggled to understand the logic of his father's throne world, but they then manifested Kira, Blade Transform, who grasped the logic and became determined to master the Ascendant Realm. The Vex teleported away from Crota and slaughtered thousands of Hive throughout the dimension, granting them greater power. Crota and his sisters fought the Vex and created new weapons to defeat them, but Kira fled to the other side of the wound created by Crota and built gates to prevent him from closing it. After a century of stalemate, the war was ended when Oryx was summoned back by Ir. Although Oryx saved his throne world from the Vex and became intrigued by their fascination with geometry, he punished Crota for his reckless experiment by exiling him from his court. Grabbing him by one of his legs, the Taken King flung his progeny into the Vex Gate network and ordered him to return home covered in glory or not at all. For centuries, Crota traversed the Vex's gate network and fought across space and time, becoming a demon in many cultures. As time passed, he adjusted his tactics as he gained a greater understanding of his father and ceased to spare some of his victims, whom he complained about his father to, and instead built mighty temples and monuments to himself to increase his power through tribute, strengthening himself and his father. Meanwhile, his father would also raise Thalnok, the fanatic of Crota, as a proxy to observe his absent son after he found favor in the latter's attempts to mantle him. Over time, during his imposed exile, Crota himself would be joined in his symphatic consort, Omnigul, the Will of Crota, a zealous wizard who became the mother of his own devoted brood. The two of them together would raise Crota's own court of disciples, including Sardon, the Fist of Crota, and the Death Singer, Iriut. At one point, a then-nameless Lokar had attempted to murder Omnigul to fuel her own tith. Crota gave chase to the fleeing wizard, only for her to have escaped his wrath, frustrating the exiled Hive Prince. He went before Oryx and demanded his father kill Lokar for her impudence. Oryx was instead amused and impressed by the wizard's ability to evade his son, and raised her to his court, rebuking Crota for his simplicity. Crota also created a mighty ogre for his own design as a means to challenge the wizard Kegor, the World Render, which Omnigul claimed as her own personal summon. Among his greatest of Crota's spawn was Hashladun, the eldest of 4 daughters, along with her sisters Bezereth, Keenox, and Voshar. Even as a young thrall, she came to Crota's attention, as she was able to contend with knights in strength and size. Intrigued by Hashladun, Crota ordered her inundated in the old way of floods to remove her excesses and leave her distilled down to her most powerful form through purification. Hashladun fought the forces Crota sent against her, slaying them all, but Crota himself then came for her, even more deeply impressed by her love for him, expressed by her strong display of will in defying him. Dragging his daughter to a floodplain in the Ascendant Realm, he impaled her to its base in the 6 places and began the ritual of inundation. Hashladun survived the ritual and emerged weakened by the ritual, but stronger for it. Murdering the first living thing she encountered to regain her strength, Crota came before her proud and impressed, but in sorrow informed her that in her newfound greatness she could not love him, as most of what had been his in her had washed away, and left behind only what was of her grandfather Oryx. With a cry of joy and grief, he cut a hole in his realm and cast her out of his court to join the ranks of his fathers. At some point in the collapse, Crota and his spawn came to the Sol System, in his everlasting pursuit of the Traveler, and to wipe the last bastion of humanity it had protected. Crota would also leave the Hive in conquering Luna, which held the pyramid of the disciple Nezarec buried beneath the surface since the Traveler's final attack. His spawn hollowed out the planetoid into a war moon, where they laid dormant until they launched their own invasion of Earth during the early City Age. In addition to Luna and the former disciple's pyramid, Crota became interested in the space station's cockatus, which contained experimental gates from the golden age of humanity. He established his hold over these gates and created a manifold into his throne realm. From there, Crota and his brood could commune with whispers echoed through the cockatus gates, learning to create the first weapon of sorrow. The Guardians barely repelled the Hive offense at the Battle of the Burning Lake, not realizing the true threat that the Hive posed. They launched a counterattack on the moon, which was later called the Great Disaster. The sword logic proved to be too much for the Guardians, as countless heroes fell before Crota's blades. The God Knight himself would emerge from the abyss as he cracked Luna's surface with every stroke of his sword, and took the light of every Guardian life that it fell. Gunvor the Dawncaller would rally the remaining Titans from the First Pillar Order in a desperate charge against Crota, sacrificing themselves to the Eater of Hope in a futile bid for time. Soon he would face the legendary Titan Wei Ning, overwhelming the striker with the paracausal might of the sword logic as he impaled her upon his cleaver. As a further show of dominance over his foes and their light, Crota took the life of a Guardian using their own ghost, whose shell was hammered into a knife. His leadership and the power of his sword led to the Hive hordes to victory during the battle, slaying thousands of Guardians and driving them away from the moon for more than a century out of fear of Crota's power. Despite this great victory for the Hive, Crota's plans for further conquest of humanity were put on hold due to his father calling him back to the Ascendant Plane for their final victory together. Within the Sea of Screams, however, two knights, one of Oryx and one of Xivu Arath, engaged in a duel of honor in their respective masters. The duel ended in a draw, but both flung themselves into the depths of an abyss, so the Knight of Oryx failed to make his tribute to a champion of Crota. The setback cost Crota's champion a significant tribute at the necessary time, and thus led to his defeat in a duel against the Sergeant of the God of War. Having suffered a major loss of temples and tributaries for his father, Crota judged it best to sleep upon his throne world and recover his lost tiths while his soul remained tethered to the Ascendant Crystal, giving him a quick means to return to the real universe once his strength was restored. He would also entrust his own sword to the 4 swarm princes of the Hidden Swarm, to guard within the depths of the Hellmouth until his return to the physical world. Seeking revenge for the great disaster and the death of Wei Ning, Ariana III led 5 other guardians in an attempt to assassinate Crota within his throne world, but the hordes of Hive dwelling within the Hellmouth managed to overwhelm the fire team, picking them off one by one. Only one of the guardians, Eris Morn, survived, forever changed by her harrowing experiences trapped in the Hellmouth and obsessed with ending Crota before he awoke. Decades later, Crota's court began preparing for his return to the physical realm by invading the Cosmodrome on Earth, with his consort Omnigul leading the effort to raise the Hive army for a full-scale invasion of the city upon his return. Having foreseen the imminent return of Crota, Eris called upon the aid of a newly risen guardian to aid her in dismantling Crota's army. The guardian successfully assassinated Crota's closest lieutenants, including the Swarm Princes and their commander, Sardon. As Crota's resurrection draws near, Eris guides the Guardian to the moon, where the chamber housing Crota's soul was located. The Guardian arrives in the midst of the summoning ritual, and works to disrupt it and slay the ritualist wizards. The crystal tethering Crota's soul in the Chamber of Night would be sent back to the Ascendant Realm, banishing his shadowing presence from the physical world, and thereby preventing his corporeal return. Afterwards, Crota's horde was thrown into further disarray when the Guardians killed Omnigul in a strike operation, which prevents any further attempt to fully revive him. Crota's end would be met by the Guardian leading a newly formed raid team upon the Oversoul throne. Entering from the deepest pit of the Hellmouth, the Guardian summoned Crota from his crystal to engage in his own throne world, surrounded by his army of Ascendant Hive. When conventional means failed before the Hope Eater, the Guardians turned Crota's own sword logic against him with the cleavers of his broken blades, permanently killing him. Crota's demise ultimately caught the attention of his father Oryx, the then God King of the Hive and Master of the Taken. Enraged by the death of his son, Oryx would bring his Dreadnaught into the solar system and lead an army of Hive and Taken in revenge against the Guardians. Ironically, Crota's lingering ascendant power was necessary for the Guardians to access the Rupture Gateway into Oryx's sanctum. Returning to the Chamber of Night that tended to the crystal that housed Crota's soul, the Guardians were able to gain a shard of the crystal, but it did not hold a piece of his soul. The Guardians now had to disrupt Crota's death ceremony to gain a sliver of his soul. Entering Crota's fortress, the Guardians narrowly slipped past the Hive defending his tomb, and were able to fill the shard with Crota's death essence. With the Ascendant Shard, the Guardians were successfully able to enter Oryx's throne and defeat him. Like his son, Oryx would later fall to the Guardians who killed Crota, when he was slain by them in his own throne world within the Ascendant Plane. Crota's disowned, heretical, and forgotten brother Nokris would make his own stand against the Guardians, after arising from slumber in the icy depths of Mars' Hellas Basin with his master, the worm god Zal. The Herald of Zal sought to conquer the Red Planet for his god, but like his former family, Nokris would fall against the Warrior of Light. As Crota was the first Hive god the Guardians ever faced and one of their most notorious foes, he haunts the Risen in their memories. Following the Scorn hunts and the continuous fight for the Dreaming City, Crota's form would manifest as a nightmare blocking the Guardians' path to the derelict pyramid beneath the Scarlet Keep. The newly spawned nightmare of Crota would prove too much for the Guardian to face, who took an essence from it before they were saved by Eris Morn. The Guardian would later face the Crota nightmare again as they were coaxed into the interior of the pyramid which they then succeeded in destroying. Crota's immediate family would be survived by his daughters, Bezereth, Vosher, Keenox, and the eldest Hashladun. Atop the newly erected Scarlet Keep upon Luna in Sorrow's Harbor, the daughters laid plans for the Hive's future, and to achieve vengeance by creating a deathless champion under their control through heretical means. Hashladun and Bezereth would both be killed by guardians, leaving Vosher and Keenox to complete their work while hiding out. Unfortunately for Crota's line, both Vosher and Keenox, along with their own children, would be killed by Osiris, when Savathûn lured the remnants of the Scarlet Court into one place to be destroyed in one fell swoop. The Witch Queen planned this in belief that the bloodline of Oryx had run its course. In his youth, Crota was a great warrior, although extremely brash and arrogant. His father Oryx believed he lacked the cunning of his sisters, which led to Crota being easily tricked by his aunt Savathûn into opening a portal into the Vex realm, which taught the machines the sword logic and planted the seeds for the eventual taking of Kira, the blade transform. As the millennia wore on, Crota gained more respect for his father and a greater understanding of the sword logic, increasing both their power through mighty temples of tribute. He exiled his brother Nokris, and remarked that he had a taste for glory. By the time of the Great Disaster, Crota had reached the pinnacle of his strength, and could easily wipe out hundreds of light-empowered guardians, including Wei Ning, one of the last city's greatest champions. Nokris, the supplicant to Savathûn, is a Hive god and estranged son of Oryx, the Taken King. Exiled by Oryx for his heresies, Nokris performed a pact with the worm god Zal, the Will of the Thousands, taking the title Herald of Zal, and leading a new brood of Hive known as the Grasp of Nokris. Zal, Nokris, and their followers would later travel to Mars during the collapse, where they were imprisoned by the polar ice by the warmind Rasputin. Following Zal's abandonment of Nokris in favor of the Guardians, Nokris pledged his allegiance to his aunt Savathûn, the Witch Queen, in a bid to end the Hive's pact to the Worm and the Witnesses. He served as the final antagonist of the Season of Arrivals, working for Savathûn to subvert the Witnesses' messages, until he was defeated by the Guardians. Born to Oryx, the Taken King, Nokris was disfavored by his father for his physical weakness. To make up for this, Nokris instead honed his mind, teaching himself Hive arcana, and hoarding knowledge and stories. In doing so, he found a different way of feeding his worm through the sword logic. Seeking to gain his father's favor, Nokris attempted to commune with the worm gods as Oryx once did, but most of them rejected his atrocities. However, Zal, fearing an imminent attack from Yul, agreed to make a pact with Nokris, who traded his heart for some of Zal's power and the forbidden secret of necromancy. Upon learning of his son's actions, Oryx was furious. Necromancy was considered a heretical violation of the sword logic, for it returns life to that which was recently slain. And thus Nokris' actions were sacrilege. For his crimes, Oryx exiled his son and removed all references to him from the Book of Sorrow and the World's Grave. Only a statue within the Dreadnaught remained, bearing Nokris' name but no additional information. Nokris was unperturbed, for in exile he saw freedom and opportunity. He informed Zal that he would claim Mars in his name, and raised a new brood, the Grasp of Nokris, to conquer the planet. Upon arriving on Mars during the collapse, Nokris, Zal, and their forces were met with overwhelming resistance from the warmind Rasputin, who eventually invoked his Siberian Entropy protocol and froze the invaders beneath a layer of ice in Hellas Basin. Nokris first became known to the Guardians when the young wolf found a statue in the Dreadnaught near the altar of Oryx, alongside similar statues of Crota and Oryx. The Guardian's ghost inferred Nokris was a Hive god based on the accompanying glyphs, but did not recognize the name. At Eris Morn's request, Asher Mir scoured his library for references to Nokris, but turned up nothing. After the deaths of Oryx and Crota at the end of the Red War, Nokris and his master were released when the ice in the Hellas Basin began to melt, an effect of the light released by the Traveler's reawakening. Together, Nokris and Zal sought retribution for their imprisonment, and engaged once more with the Warmind. However, interference came in the form of the Guardian working with Anna Bray, who tried to lure Zal into the open using a small shard of the Traveler as bait. Nokris arrived to fight the intruders, but after a fierce battle he was slain by the Guardians. Nokris managed to evade permanent death following Zul's defeat, only to be left abandoned within the crust of Mars. His attempts to reconnect with the worm god were rebuffed, as it had already found more worth in his slayers. Dejected, Nokris sought entry into the Ascendant Plane, which was previously denied to him due to his rejection of the sword logic, using a fragment of Zul's remains to force a gate open. He lured fire teams of guardians under the pretense of resurrecting Zul into slaughtering him and his revenant Hive, gaining enough power from their acts of violence to feed Zul's remains, enough to use it to pierce a tiny hole into the Sea of Screams, through which his soul could slip into. However, the trickery he used attacked and attracted the attention of his aunt Savathûn. Although expecting to be used as nothing more than a simple pawn, Nokris struck a bargain with her after Savathûn offered him a place in her court, and acknowledged his value in being able to overturn the sword logic and those bound by it. As Savathûn fought to free herself from the witness, who was bound in servitude by her pact with the worms, she desired Nokris' knowledge of necromancy. In exchange for his secrets, she would grant him access to the dreaming mind, so that he could learn how to take. Savathûn also foresaw the arrival of the Black Fleet in Sol, and so she instructed him to interfere in any of their attempts to communicate with the Guardians. 2 years after his initial defeat on Mars, Nokris would resurface as the supplicant to the Witch Queen herself, playing his role as a catalyst to intervene with the Witness's messages at the Tree of Silver Wings on Io, armed with massive shriekers belonging to Savathûn called Savathûn's Witnesses. The supplicant would shroud the cradle with the Witch Queen's influence and even lay a trap out for Eris Morn and the Guardian, threatening the life of the former and pulling the latter into a counterfeit version of the Witch Queen's throne world within the Ascendant Plane. Eris barely survives her encounter, and in turn saves the Guardian from the full force of the Shriekers. For a period of 18 weeks, Nokris commands armies of Hive and the Taken to swarm the tree enshrouded in Savathûn's influence, with one of her Shriekers, barring the Witness's messages directly with Eris and the Guardians. Each week, the Guardians would face one of the massive Shriekers at the cradle before they are summoned back to the Ascendant Plane, to which Nokris mocks them in whispers and even insults their ghost at one point, drawing comparisons to a worm. Nonetheless, the Guardians' efforts were proven successful at destroying the massive Shriekers, and allowed Eris to briefly interpret the Black Fleet's messages with the Seed of Silver Wings. On the final week, Eris had successfully identified Nokris as the source of the interference, just as the supplicant would summon the Guardian into a new area of the court, where he would face them directly once more near the backdrop of a massive Taken blight the size of a star. Throughout the fight, Nokris addresses them as a mere pawn tied to the everlasting struggle between light and darkness, to which he offered to have them free of in eternal servitude to Savathûn. However, the Hive heretic's offers would only fall on deaf ears as the Guardian destroyed him for seemingly a final time, diminishing the Witch Queen's influence considerably and allowing the Witness' final message to reach the Guardian. Despite his death at the hands of the Guardians, Nokris would leave a legacy on the future of the Hive. His knowledge of necromancy would influence the creation of the Lucent Brood, which his own Hive would eventually pledge themselves fully to Savathûn and then join the ranks of. Ir-Halak, the Death Singer, is one of Oryx's 2 daughters created after Oryx cut a larva in half. The Death Singer's sisters were first encountered in Last Rites, when the player is infiltrating Crota's death ceremony. They're found next to Crota's tomb, and have to be avoided. Together with her twin sister Iranok, the Death Singer, she is encountered and killed in the King's Fall raid and Threshold. Ir-Halak and her sister Iranok were created from the same larva cleft into by Oryx's sword Willbreaker. He praised them for their cunning and intellect, especially Ir-Halak, for creating a death song, the signature weapon of the Death Singers, and which gave the twins their title. After telling her of her aunt's displeasure, he asked if they would be using their songs instead of weapons to fight their wars. Later, as Oryx wrestled with his worm, Ir-Halak and Iranok began to die repeatedly in a certain place, ostensibly for no reason. When asked what they were doing, they launched into a high technical description of what Oryx eventually forced them to conclude simply, if we hide our deaths from ourselves, we become harder to kill. Thus came about the birth of the first prototype Oversoul. Oryx ordered his son Crota to watch his sisters. fearing they were trying to go into the deep and to learn cunning. Unfortunately, it was Crota who needed watching. He began to conspire with his sisters, and thought rashly he too would seek for himself a power. Using his sword, he cut a hole in the Ascendant Realm, and unwittingly let in the Vex led by Kira, Blade Transform, who mocked his attempts to contain them by simply blinking away from him whenever he attacked. As the Vex killed thousands of Hive and empowered themselves with the sword logic, Ir-Halak called upon their fellow Death Singers to assist her in Iranok with the creation of the Annihilator Totem. The weapon proved effective, but the two sides entered a stalemate as Kira fled to the other side of the gate and launched repeated invasions of the Ascendant Realm, while the siblings' invasions of the Vex territory left them too weakened to finish off the Vex mind. After 100 years of warfare, Ir-Halak worried that Oryx would return and eat their souls for their failures. Upon Oryx's return, he punished only Crota for his role in the Vex invasion, and then built the Dreadnaught to protect his realm. Ir-Halak and Iranok built the weaponry and internal systems for the ship, allowing Oryx to concentrate his ascendant power and obliterate any foe. Billions of years later, Ir-Halak and Iranok joined their father in traveling to the Sol System to seek revenge upon the Guardian who slew their brother Crota. Although the Dreadnaught was halted in the orbit of Saturn following a battle with the Awoken Fleet, the two sisters traveled aboard the warship to Luna to conduct the death ceremony that would send what remained of Crota's soul to the next realm. However, the ceremony was interrupted by the Guardian who slew Crota, who now sought to steal remnants of his soul to pass as an Ascendant Hive. Outraged at the intrusion and seeking vengeance for their brother, Ir-Halak and Iranok attempted to slay the Guardian alongside the other Death Singers and Hive warriors present. The Guardian escaped their grasp thanks to the intervention of Eris Morn, who teleported them away from the Hive. The sisters later barred the way to their father by challenging the Guardians sent to kill him. As their father's last line of defense, they used their death songs to fight and unright the Guardians. They were eliminated, and the way to Oryx the Taken King was clear. Ir-Anuk, the Death Singer, is one of Oryx the Taken King's two daughters, created after Oryx cut a larva in half. The Death Singer's sisters were first encountered in Last Rites, when the player is infiltrating Crota's death ceremony. They are found next to Crota's tomb, and have to be avoided. Together with her twin sister Ir-Halak, a Death Singer, she is encountered and killed in the King's Fall raid in Threshold. Ir-Anuk and her sister Ir-Halak were created from the same larvae cleft into by Oryx's sword, Willbreaker. He praised them for their cunning and intellect, especially Ir-Anuk for her ambitious methods of apotheosis. She wrote out the 11 axioms which described the Ascendant Realm and plotted to kill one. Oryx commended her by saying he may kill her for trying. Later, as Oryx wrestled with his worm, Ir-Anuk and Ir-Halak began to die repeatedly in certain places, ostensibly for no reason. When asked what they were doing, they launched into a highly technical description that Oryx eventually forced them to conclude simply, "If we hide our deaths from ourselves, we become harder to kill." Thus came about the birth of the first prototype Oversoul. Oryx ordered his son Crota to watch his sisters, fearing they were trying to go into the deep and to learn cunning. Unfortunately, it was Crota who needed watching. He began to conspire with his sisters and thought rashly he would seek for himself a power. Using his sword, he cut a hole into the Ascendant Realm, and unwittingly let in the Vex, who mocked his attempts to contain them by simply blinking from him whenever he attacked. His sisters went to help him. Ir-Anuk created an Annihilator Totem, while Ir-Halak called upon their fellow Death Singers, as they fought the Vex who learned all too quickly how the realm worked, and proved difficult to dislodge. Later, in order to protect his realm, Oryx built the Dreadnaught. Ir-Anuk and Ir-Halak built the weaponry and internal systems for the ship, allowing Oryx to concentrate his ascendant power and obliterate any foe. Billions of years later, Ir-Halak and Ir-Anuk joined their father in traveling to the Sol System to seek revenge upon the Guardian who slew their brother Crota. Although the Dreadnaught was halted in the orbit of Saturn following a battle with the Awoken Fleet, the two sisters traveled aboard another warship to Luna to conduct the death ceremony that would send what remained of Crota's soul to the next realm. However, the ceremony was interrupted by the Guardian who slew Crota, who now sought to steal remnants of his soul to pass as an Ascendant Hive. Outraged at the intrusion and seeking vengeance for their brother, Ir-Halak and Ir-Anuk attempted to slay the Guardian alongside the other Death Singers and Hive warriors present. The Guardian escaped their grasp thanks to the intervention of Eris Morn, who teleported them away from the Hive. The sisters later barred the way to their father by challenging the Guardian sent to kill him. As their father's last line of defense, they used their death songs to fight and unright the Guardians. They were eliminated, and the way to Oryx, the Taken King, was clear. Alakul the Darkblade is a Hive Darkblade Knight, foster son of Oryx, the Taken King, and the boss of the Sunless Cell Strike. After being killed by the Guardians, he was resurrected years later as Alakul the Lightblade by a Hive ghost of the Lucent Brood, and became the boss of the Lightblade Strike. Alakul and his consort, Varrock, were present at the Hellmouth when Eris Morn and Ariana III led their fire team to assassinate Crota, the son of Oryx. It was Alakul and Varrock's spawn that killed the Titan Vel Tarlo, with the former delivering the killing blow upon his axe. Following the failed raid, Alakul and Varrock instigated a rebellion against Oryx, but the rebellion was put down. Alakul's motivation was twofold. First, because he felt neglected by Oryx, which was deliberate, as Oryx wanted Alakul to become a hungering blade, and second, to appraise himself in the eyes of Varrock. Alakul was captured by Oryx's warriors, and the Taken King decreed that Alakul be imprisoned aboard the Dreadnaught, never to see the light again. But after Oryx retreated from the material realm, Eris wanted to make sure Alakul couldn't take over as the king of the Hive, and to avenge Tarlo, ordered for his elimination. And so a fire team went down into his dark cell and killed him. At some unknown point several years later, after the Darkblade's death, a Hive ghost would come across and resurrect Alakul, retitled as the Lightblade. Alakul would then join forces with the Lucent Brood and become a formidable ally. He was tasked by Savathûn, the Witch Queen, to guard a temple commemorating Oryx, which housed a piece of the Tablets of Ruin. Assisted by light-bearing warriors and normal knights, disciples as his personal guards, the temple was well defended. This was until a fire team of guardians, following a lead from Finch about a potential clue from the temple, ran into Alakul, who was away from his post, who then fled back into the temple. Facing off against his warriors and disciples, along with hitching a ride on a ferry and evading scorn to reach the temple, the fire team would enter the monument. Gifted with arc light powers and guards at his disposal, the Lightblade tried to defend the temple from the Guardians, but was slain as a result. However, Alakul's ghost would escape from the temple, leaving his body behind. Hashladun, the daughter of Crota, is an Ascendant Hive wizard and the eldest of the daughters, along with Bezereth, Voshur, and Kinox, of the Hive god Crota, son of Oryx, and Omnigul, the will of Crota, as well as granddaughter of Oryx, the Taken King. She is the leader of the Hidden Swarm and architect of the Scarlet Keep, harnessing the nightmares of the pyramid that lies beneath for her schemes and vengeance against the Guardians. Hashladun would meet her end by the Guardian at the top of the Tower of Woe, as part of her revenge against them, only to be killed by their fire team. Hashladun began as an abnormally large and strong thrall, huge of crest and thick of arm. Viewing this as excessive, her father Crota ordered her ritually mutilated in the old way of floods, in order to reduce her to a normal size and strength, and sent 100 thrall, 10 knights, and an ogre to retrieve her. Hashladun fought off the entire force, but was left exhausted. After that, Crota himself came for her, impressed but unrelenting, and took her to a floodplain deep within the Ascendant Plane, where she was impaled and exposed to the paracausal tides of the Sea of Screams, flooding her body 5 times with caustic and harmful substances. After the 5 inundations, Hashladun broke free from her impalement, starving, wounded, and much reduced in form. On witnessing her crawling back to his throne world, Crota stated, "You are great now, and you cannot love me, for the parts of you that were mine have been taken from you. The parts that were his remain." With all ties to Crota severed by the floods, and therefore rendered closer to Oryx, Hashladun had ascended into her grandfather's court, much to her father's joy and grief, knowing that she can never set foot in his court again. She was then sent forth to Oryx's side by her father, who cut a rift through space-time to an unknown destination. It is largely unknown what role Hashladun played in her grandfather's court, but she was presumed dead by the Guardians since Crota's fall. Following the Taken War, Hashladun hid between the lunar surface alongside her sisters Bezereth, Keenox, and Vosher, and plotted their revenge against the Guardians for the deaths of her immediate family. Unable to accept a world without their king, Hashladun and her sisters enacted a plot to recreate their deceased grandfather in the form of a phantasmal nightmare, a necessary violation of the sword logic, since the taken king was never succeeded by his killers. They also believed that Oryx might yet be truly resurrected, having been defeated before and returning to life through sheer will and tribute in his name. As the Coven of Sisters worked to enact their sinister plot, they were still left to deal with conspirators and contenders for the vacancy of a champion left by their late father. Many of the Hive that still held to the old beliefs in the sword logic gave way to gladiatorial combat in the pit beneath the keep, though none of the sisters believed any were worthy of their father or grandfather's succession. Hashladun and her sisters attended the pit to witness the gladiatorial games, and silenced Bezereth and Vosher as they expressed doubts about the fighters when the games began. Of the greatest contenders was the knight Zulmak, whose triumphs in the pit threatened to upend Hashladun's plans if anointed the new Hive champion by the majority of the swarm. Hashladun judged Zulmak a great warrior, but lacking the cunning of Crota and Oryx, and turned to leave the pit alongside her sisters, which prompted much of the congregation to do the same. They were forced to return for a third fight, as Zulmak's performance had persuaded many that his strength as a warrior made him a worthy successor under the sword logic. This belief disgusted Hashladun, who noted that Zulmak's opponents were not impressive, as most of the Hidden Swarm's greatest warriors had been slain by Guardians already. However, Zulmak's reign was cut short by the Death Singer Savathûn, whose body had merged with the essence of her knight brother, Akrazul, and went on a blind massacre with a royal congregation. Taking advantage of the ensuing chaos, Hashladun and her sisters assassinated their perceived enemies, leaving the Akrazul-possessed Azavath to take the blame, and none left to challenge them. As the Coven of Sisters made ready to leave, Hashladun glanced once more into the pit, and was greeted by the whispers of a fellow schemer, their great-aunt Savathûn. She encouraged her nieces to seize control of the Hidden Swarms themselves, and be the strength the Hive needed to challenge the light with the mighty new fortress. Additionally, she offered a boon in the essence of the fallen Zulmak, to be raised as a puppet champion for the swarm. Intrigued but wary of her aunt's schemes, Hashladun questioned what role the heretic Azavath reborn Iraram Deathsinger would play. As they killed their maddened brother Azakrul with the Death Song, Savathûn offered her a second boon as the head of the reformed choir, a legendary group of death singers, to be used as another weapon in their upcoming battle against the Guardians. With their control over the Hidden Swarm secured, the daughters of Crota rallied the remaining Hive on the moon, and began construction of the Scarlet Keep, acting as an amplifier of their magics, and to ward themselves of the pyramid's influences with the forbidden cryptoglyph. While the Hive were unable to conjure nightmares, they instead bade their time for one behind Oryx's killers to be their catalyst, manipulated of her curiosity by the Witch Queen herself. After Eris Morn's discovery of the pyramid unleashed its phantasmal power, Hashladun utilized the Great Tower of the Scarlet Keep to channel its energy for their experiments, which helped the Hive summon nightmares of great power near the keep, based on the fears and fast foes of the Guardians, including one of her late father. Using the cryptoglyph, Hashladun experimented with the creations of the ancient pyramid, and found no hope of truly restoring Oryx and Crota through their power, as their essences had truly disappeared. However, she and her sisters embraced Savathûn's gifts, and began crafting what remained of Zulmak into a fearsome champion of their own design and under their control. Through her experiments, Hashladun distilled the primordial essence of terror and contributed it to Bezereth and Vosher's reshaping of Zulmak's husk. When the Guardians invaded the moon to challenge the Hive's resurgence and the appearance of the nightmares, Hashladun personally encountered the Guardian who slew her father, mother, and grandfather at the bridge to the keep. Retreating to the top of the spire, Hashladun lures the Guardian and their fire team to her position to finally claim her revenge for her ravaged lineage. Having gathered potent energies to amplify her powers, the inundated summons waves of Hive reinforcements to swarm her enemies, and use her magic in several attempts to knock them off the tower. In her quest for vengeance, however, Hashladun met her demise in flames, much like her family. From her remains, the Guardians found a tablet containing evidence of the cryptoglyph hidden at the bottom of the Hellmouth. So, Bezereth, the daughter of Crota, is a child of the Hive Prince Crota seen in the Deep mission, where she and some scholars attempted to protect the cryptoglyph from the Guardian, attempting to protect the key Hive artifact, preserving it within the catacombs, and helped to perpetuate her sister's plan. She personally attacked the Guardian to keep the cryptoglyph from falling into their hands, resulting in her inevitable demise. Along with her sisters Hashladun, Kinox, and Vosher, Bezereth retained her faith in Oryx even after his death, believing it to be the only way to save the Hidden Swarm, as no successor to Oryx had emerged. They forged a plan to resurrect him in the form of a nightmare. Moreover, knowing Oryx's immense power of will and vast tribute, they believed their king could yet come back as he had in the past. While the sisters plotted, various Hive champions fought in the pit for the vacant osmium throne, most notably Zulmak, whose victory could threaten their plans before they had a chance to truly unravel. The sisters didn't believe any of the gladiators were worthy of their grandfather's legacy, and observed the battles with disgust. Zulmak kept winning every fight, gaining the title of the Unwavering, until he was challenged by an unlikely adversary, the Death Singer Azavath, her body actually a shell for her brother Cruel's essence. Upon defeating Zulmak, Azavath, now Akrazul, began slaughtering members of the court watching the pit fights. The royal sisters made to escape, but Bezereth halted them and asked them to consider the moment of chaos as a perfect opportunity to eliminate the opponents to their rule. All four drew daggers from their cloaks and turned against those court's members they deemed a threat, then promptly left with the surviving remains of the congregation. Bezereth was later tasked with protecting the cryptoglyph deep within the catacombs. She fell to the Guardian, and the artifact was stolen in order to allow Eris Morn to forge equipment protecting the Guardian from the nightmares. Vosher was one of the daughters of Crota, the son of Oryx. Together with her sisters Hashladun, Bezereth, and Kinox, they were collectively leading the Hidden Swarm on the moon. She was also the mother of the wizards Yashara and Arax. She met her end by the hand of Osiris. Vosher and her sisters Hashladun, Bezereth, and Kinox took leadership of the Hidden Swarm on the moon after their grandfather's passing during the Taken War. What they lacked in brute strength of the sword logic, they made up for in cunning, thought, and grand design. They considered themselves the shadowed architects of empires. They build their legacy upon the trade of secrets, the gossip of ages, and the sowing of lies. Words their weapons, cutting as any blade. Rather than adhere to the tenets of the sword logic, Vosher and her sisters schemed to preserve the glory of their forebearers, including Oryx and Crota. Sometime before the events of Shadowkeep, the daughters of Crota saw opportunity in an ancient pyramid buried beneath the surface, which they could possibly conjure the essences of Crota and Oryx. However, as they speculate, they were also attentive to the pit, where Hive fought in gladiatorial combat for claim to their father's vacant throne, to which they must judge those worthy. Vosher expressed her doubts in the Hive after Bezereth only silenced by Hashladun's narrowing glare. However, with the sudden appearance of the Death Singer Azavath, killing the reigning champion Zulmak caused a panic among the royal congregation. The daughters took the chance to assassinate their enemies. With no one threatening their schemes, the daughters were free to enact their plan and had the swarm raise the Scarlet Keep. With the nightmares unleashed at the hands of Eris Morn, Kinox and her sisters could experiment with the phantasmal creations of the pyramid. However, they found that they could not raise their father nor grandfather, as their essences had truly dissipated, and that the nightmares were not alive. Instead, Kinox urged her sisters to act, seeing the potential in raising Zulmak as a warrior bound to their victims. Vosher and Bezereth would gather Zulmak's husk, while Hashladun offered the nightmare essence of terror to them. However, Hashladun and Bezereth would both meet their ends by the Guardians, leaving Vosher and Kinox to continue their work and abandon the sword logic for the sake of survival. The two would enact their forbidden ritual to empower the abominable Zulmak with the power of the nightmares, all while hiding out in fear of the Guardians. A year after the events of Shadowkeep, Vosher and her sister Kinox were met with the High Celebrant, a champion of their great aunt Xivu Arath, the god of war, having entered the system to build an army of Wrathborn, and to rally the scattered Hive broods into her service. Having gathered with their own spawn beneath the enduring abyss to commune with the war god, they were immediately confronted by the warlock Osiris, who incinerated Vosher and her daughters Yashura and Arax with his daybreak. Kinox was one of the surviving daughters of Crota, the son of Oryx, along with her sisters Hashladun, Bezereth, and Vosher, collectively leading the hidden swarm on the moon. She was also the mother of Ulgarin, a knight in command of her guard. She would be killed at the hands of the exiled warlock Osiris. Kinox and her sisters Hashladun, Bezereth, and Vosher took control of the hidden swarm after their grandfather's passing during the Taken War. What they lacked in brute strength of the sword logic, they made up for in cunning, thought, and grand design. They consider themselves the shadowed architects of empires. They build their legacy upon the trade of secrets, the gossip of ages, and the sowing of lies. Words are their weapons, cutting as any blade. Rather than adhere to the tenets of the sword logic, Kinox and her sisters schemed to preserve the glory of their forebears, including Oryx and Crota. Sometime before the events of Shadowkeep, the daughters of Crota saw an opportunity in the ancient pyramid buried beneath the surface, which they could possibly conjure the essences of Crota and Oryx. However, as they speculate, they were also attentive to the pit, where Hive fought in gladiatorial combat for claim for their father's vacant throne, which they must judge those worthy. Kinox remained silent, contemplating their station and the depths from which they must ascend if the swarm is ever to reclaim its own destiny. However, with the sudden appearance of the Death Singer Azavath, killing the reigning champion Zulmak caused a panic among the royal congregation. The daughters took the chance to assassinate their enemies. With no one threatening their schemes, the daughters were free to enact their plan and have the swarm raise the Scarlet Keep. With the nightmares unleashed at the hands of Eris Morn, Kinox and her sisters could experiment with the phantasmal creations of the pyramid. However, they found that they could not raise their father nor grandfather, as their essences had truly dissipated, and that the nightmares were not alive. Instead, Kinox urged her sisters to act, seeing the potential in raising Zulmak as a warrior bound to their whims. However, Hashladun and Bezereth would meet their ends by guardians, leaving Kinox to act free without fear of heresy. She and Vosher would enact their forbidden ritual to empower the abominable Zulmak with the power of the nightmares, all while hiding out in fear of the guardians. A year after the events of Shadowkeep, Kinox and her sister Vosher were met with the High Celebrant, a champion of their great aunt Xivu Arath, the god of war, having entered the system to build an army of Wrathborn, and to rally the scattered Hive broods into her sway. Having gathered with their spawn beneath the enduring abyss to commune with the war god, they were immediately confronted by the warlock Osiris. Kinox would die attempting to flee from the ensuing battle, along with her son Ulgarin, who perished in a vain attempt to protect her from a Nova Bomb. So what did you guys think of the entire family of Oryx the Taken King? Please let me know in the comments down below. If you haven't already, please be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, join the Sith Citadel Discord, links in the description, and consider becoming a join member or sending a super thanks if you wish to further support the channel. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.